The courthouse corridor smelled of reheated coffee and paper damp with stamps. With each step, my heels struck as if calling someone to wake up. Perhaps the girl I once was, perhaps the woman waiting for me on the other side of the door. The marble wall reflected my face with the robe folded over my arm, and a security guard, young, held my gaze a second longer than necessary. "Whose hearing did you come to accompany, ma'am?" he asked, polite like someone who has already learned the path of prejudice through the route of courtesy. "I didn't come to accompany anyone," I replied, and let the silence complete the sentence. On the wooden bench, my parents. Sunday clothes on a weekday, my father's crooked tie, my mother's dress shining less than she wanted. When they saw me, they didn't smile. They pulled their bodies in as if trying to fit into an old portrait. Her gaze descended to my shoe, rose to my briefcase, stopped at the piece of black fabric hanging from my arm, the robe, and then looked away as if the fabric were improper for sight. "Daughter, sit here with us," she said, and daughter came out thin, almost an apology for existing, behind the counter, and in turn whispered to his colleague. "Is she the plaintiff?" The colleague answered without looking. "Must be a lawyer. The public defender is dark-skinned like that." Dark-skinned. The word came wrapped in moral whipped cream, but I know the taste. I placed my briefcase on the counter and handed over my professional ID. The young man read my name in a low voice, like someone trying not to wake a secret, and then returned the document with nervous haste. "Courtroom 3, ma'am." "Sorry, doctor." "Ah." I left the trail of correction in the air, a thread of dust shining against the cold light. They're ashamed, I thought, and knew the weight came less from me and more from the image my parents had kept polished for years. The studious daughter, yes, but discreet, the one who helps without appearing, the one who wins without naming the victory, because a big name scares the neighborhood. My father cleared his throat. "Don't make a scene," he asked without looking at me. My mother, lower, added, "We just want to resolve this quickly. The manager is there, and the lawyer said maybe we can—" "Hush it up. Hush it up." As if justice were a leaky pipe. The bailiff opened the wooden door. The doorknob creaked. The room smelled of expired air conditioning. He entered. The crucifix above the bench seemed smaller than in my bad on-call dreams, and the flag tired. I recognized everything. The lawyer's table, the lukewarm water in the plastic cup, the stenography machine that weaves destinies without raising its voice. I rested the robe on the back of the chair, touched the fabric with 2 fingertips, like someone confirming the skin is really theirs. A lawyer in a beige suit shot me a condescending smile. "If you need help with the order of testimonies, I'll explain, dear." The dear hit the wood and came back in echo. I just tilted my head. In the background I heard a whisper. "Who's presiding today is the substitute judge, right? The permanent judge was sworn in but only starts next week." Eyes swept over me like a flashlight searching for threat. Then the bailiff entered, placed his hand on the holster by useless reflex, and announced with a trained voice, "All rise." The rumble of legs scraping the floor filled the room. My parents stood up slowly, obedient to the liturgy. I breathed at the right tempo. What I learned so emotion wouldn't steal diction. Slipped the robe over my shoulders and felt the right weight descend down my spine, like iron on rails. Session of the Third Civil Court now in session. The substitute, the same one who had greeted me in the corridor for so many years, smiled, vacated the seat and made a simple gesture with his hand, the gesture that cuts the world in half. "The chair is yours." I walked the remaining 3 steps as if crossing all the streets where they had crossed my path without seeing me. I sat down. The leather cracked under the robe. The fountain pen aligned with the notepad. And then, without hesitation, the bailiff completed, firmly, "Your Honor." The sound entered the room and came back to me polished, clean, almost sweet. My parents, in the back row, shrank an inch more. My mother brought her hand to her chest and searched for someone to translate the obvious. The daughter who should contain herself now commands containment. The defendant's lawyer adjusted his jacket, and a short, poorly rehearsed smile escaped. "Congratulations, doctor." I nodded without returning it. I opened the case file at the exact point where the first evidence poked at the veneer. The internal bell rang. Call the first party, I said, and my own voice surprised me. Deep enough to sustain, calm enough to cross. Outside, the corridor continued smelling of coffee and stamps. In here, time had a different gravity. The newly sworn-in judge breathed inside me like someone closing a suitcase and departing. And before noting the first line of the minutes, I raised my eyes and met theirs. There was no accusation in my face. There was history. I don't make scenes, I thought. I conduct hearings. And when I read the name of the next case at the bottom of the docket, I saw a detail that wasn't in my plans. My parents' bakery's tax ID number. When I saw the bakery's name in the next case, the air seemed to deflate inside the room. The entire world fell silent. You could only hear the sound of the wall clock, that methodical tick-tock marking the rhythm of everything we tried to postpone. My eyes slowly rose from the page to the public. My parents were motionless, but the store manager, the same man I'd known since I was a girl, with the white apron and hurried speech, tried to avoid my gaze, fumbling with papers as if they could save him. For a second, I thought about requesting a suspension of the session. For another, I remembered every time they told me, a black woman needs to prove herself twice as much, and that emotion discredits. So I breathed, aligned the robe on my shoulders, and decided that no one would reduce me to daughter, to the bakery girl, to the woman who rose too high. In there I was a judge, and nothing less than that. The lawyer stood up to greet me. He had the honeyed tone of those accustomed to underestimating. "Good morning, Your Honor. I imagine this case will affect you, due to the coincidence of names." He smiled, expecting complicity. "Not coincidence, counselor. Context," I replied. He laughed awkwardly, the kind of laugh men give when they realize the power game has changed. While he spoke, I watched my parents. My mother tried to keep her chin raised, but her gaze fled to the wall, to the floor, to anywhere that wasn't me. My father adjusted himself in the chair, the knot of his tie too tight, pride and shame fighting in the same space. I knew that for them, being there before me wasn't pride, it was an affront. The daughter who studied too much, who spoke too much, who never knew how to stay in her place. I wanted to believe it was only about the bakery. But it wasn't. It was about everything that had always stuck in the throat, their fear that my color and my voice would put me in danger. Fear disguised as advice, protection dressed as silence. While the lawyer presented the evidence, flashes of the past came in waves. Me as a teenager, helping in the store, cleaning the counter. Hearing my mother tell an employee, "Keep an eye on that group, they touch the displays too much." My father asking me not to wear my uniform because it draws attention. They were phrases that, for years, I let pass. Small cracks that only now showed the entire structure of the wall. "Doctor, do you have any impediment in this case?" asked the lawyer with false concern in his voice. He closed the case file calmly. "I have ethics," I replied. "And therefore the case will be redistributed. But before that, it will be heard." A murmur ran through the hall, as if someone had opened a window in the middle of mass. The manager looked at me confused. My parents even more tense. I asked them to read the complaint report. Black adolescent customers alleging humiliation, unjustified searches, refusal of service, charging of extra fees on products bought by public school groups. Everything there registered with date, time, and receipt. Each word echoed on the wall, and I could feel their weight hitting my back. "Mrs. Marta, owner, confirms that such policies were adopted?" asked the clerk. My mother hesitated, and her voice came out thin. "We only did that to avoid confusion." Avoid confusion. The same phrase she used when she asked me to lower my head, to not provoke, to not speak too much. My father tried to intervene. "It was the manager's idea, not the family's. We just approved it," I completed without raising my tone. "And even if you hadn't approved it, silence is complicity." Her eyes filled with water. I didn't want to see her cry, but I also couldn't spare her. There are pains that cleanse more than they hurt. While the stenographer recorded everything, I noticed my hands were steady, steadier than ever. I didn't tremble. I didn't hesitate. For the first time, The bakery girl looked at her own history without guilt. When the session was adjourned, I stood up slowly. The hall remained silent. All rise. The formality sounded solemn, but to me it was more than a protocol. It was reparation. My parents stood up too, and it was at that instant, while I removed the robe, that my mother murmured, "Daughter, we didn't know you would go this far." I looked at her with a smile that wasn't anger nor forgiveness. It was lucidity. "Neither did I, Mom. But when the path is made of closed doors, we learn to enter through the wall." I left the room with a light body, but a pounding heart. I knew that was just the beginning, because the most difficult judgment wasn't the legal one yet. It was the one of blood. And as the corridor opened before me, I thought, being seen is a kind of sentence, and today for the first time I accepted mine. If you've also been underestimated and had to build your own authority in silence, subscribe here. This story is about justice, but also about recognition, the kind we grant ourselves. That night, the courthouse still seemed to be inside me. Every word spoken echoed as if it had been engraved on my body. The dry sound of the stamp, my mother's wavering gaze, my father's heavy silence, all mixed with the sound of the old elevator going up and down like tired breathing. I went home late. I took off my shoes at the door and stood still, looking at the pile of books on the table. On top, an open copy of Law and Human Dignity, with a note I'd written years ago. Justice begins when someone refuses the role they were expected to play. When I wrote that, I still used the same aluminum lunchbox, shared an apartment with 3 other colleagues, and dreamed of being heard without having to raise my voice. Remembering that made me smile and hurt at the same time. Because today, even with a robe on my shoulders, I still had to prove that my presence wasn't a system error. I sat on the bed and opened my phone. There were dozens of messages. Law school colleagues congratulating my appointment, acquaintances asking for referrals, and even old neighbors sending applause emojis. But among them all, one caught me. A voice message from my mother. "Daughter, I know today was difficult for everyone. But we always wanted the best for you, even if it seems otherwise. Your father has been quiet since the hearing. I think he's never felt so small. Don't hold a grudge, please. It was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding." The words lingered, light and poisonous. Since childhood, almost everything that hurt me came wrapped in softness. When racism doesn't shout, it whispers. And it's worse because we grow up learning to doubt our own pain. I remembered an old scene. Me at 14, helping at the bakery on a busy Saturday. A group of white girls entered, laughing loudly, and one of them asked how much the lemon pie cost. I answered politely. My mother pulled me aside discreetly and whispered, "Let me handle this, daughter. You speak too firmly and it scares customers." Customer. Never the customer. Never them. Always the same unspoken code. Calm as a disguise for submission. I spent the early morning reviewing the case evidence, not as a judge, but as a daughter. The messages exchanged by bakery employees, the receipts with duplicate charges, the note, "School groups, verify before selling." Everything there was the portrait of an entire country condensed on a pastry counter. And the greater irony, that bakery paid for my college. Their prejudice financed the woman who now judged what they had planted. As I thought, I realized something in me stopped being pain and became clarity. The past was giving me ammunition, not weight. And it was at that instant, with the room in silence and the sky beginning to clear, that I had an idea. I grabbed my laptop, opened a new document, and began writing the title, "Public Hearing on Veiled Discrimination Practices in Local Commerce." The proposal was simple but bold. Transform that case into a symbol. Make their shame a mirror for the entire city. As I typed, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't revenge. It was justice with an emotional signature. It was returning the blow with pen and courage. Before sleeping, I left a note stuck to the mirror, to remind me of what would come. They taught you to lower your head. Now teach the world to look up. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. Tomorrow would be the day to formally file the hearing request. And this time I wouldn't ask permission to speak. When my phone vibrated on the nightstand, a notification lit up the screen. New message received, sender, father. I opened it, not knowing whether to expect an apology or an accusation. And I read just one short phrase, worn, cowardly and familiar. Daughter, you don't need to exaggerate. The "you don't need to exaggerate" kept spinning in my head like an old sentence. It was the same phrase I'd heard since childhood. Whenever I questioned something, whenever the tone of my voice passed a millimeter beyond the permitted line. At the bakery, when I said it was wrong to charge differently, my father repeated, "It's not difference, it's precaution." At school, when the teacher made me present after everyone, he said, "Must have been coincidence." And when I came back from college telling him a white colleague had been promoted before me, even with fewer resolved cases, he said it again. "Daughter, you don't need to exaggerate." Exaggeration. That word always served to push women like me back into the corner. The next morning, the sky dawned opaque, somewhat yellowish, the kind of light that seems unwilling to commit. I arrived at the courthouse before everyone, the sound of my steps echoing through the marble corridors. I placed my bag on the desk, opened the laptop and read my proposal once more. Each sentence was a piece of my history disguised as legal thesis. A public hearing is proposed to discuss subtle discrimination practices in commercial service, based on behavior patterns that, although masked as security protocols, result in systematic racial exclusion. I signed below and sent the email. I clicked send and felt a chill run through my fingers. An old but familiar fear of making noise in a world that still demands silence from those who have my color. Few hours later, the office phone rang. It was the secretary from the office next door. "Doctor, there's a lady here asking to speak with you. She said it's a family matter." My body froze before reason even caught up. I knew. When she entered, she carried an envelope in her hands, and in her eyes that type of tear that doesn't quite fall, just threatens. "Daughter, don't do this," she began. "Do what, Mom?" "Expose us. People are talking. The pastor came to talk to me. He said God doesn't like those who shame their parents." I breathed deeply. Her faith had always been the shield for everything she didn't want to discuss. "God likes those who are just, Mom." She shook her head. "You don't understand. You're turning our pain into a spectacle. I'm turning it into precedent." The silence that followed was cutting. She opened the envelope and placed it on the desk. Childhood photos of me, newspaper clippings from the bakery's opening, the first invoice issued in their names. "All of this here was built with work. Do you want to destroy it out of pride?" I looked at each image like someone reviewing a crime committed out of love. "It's not pride. It's coherence." She pressed the envelope to her chest, her fingers trembling. "You were always the most stubborn. And you always thought stubbornness and dignity were the same bad thing." She stared at me as if trying to find inside the woman the daughter she'd lost. "Do you think it's good for everyone to know we were wrong?" "Good, no. Necessary." She breathed, exhausted. "Your father hasn't slept since yesterday. Maybe it's the first night he's thinking." The words came out harder than I wanted, but there was no other way. My mother stood up slowly, as if carrying the weight of centuries, and said before leaving, "You don't need to be everyone's judge." I stared at the door closing, and the sound of the wood hitting seemed definitive. I picked up the badge on the desk, looked at the engraved name, Dr. Helena Ramos, Judge, and answered to myself, "But I need to be my own judge." The rest of the day was a marathon of orders, but nothing touched me. Inside, I still heard the echo of her voice, mixed with the memory of the little girl who, at 7, dreamed of working in her own bakery. At night, before leaving, I opened the email again. There was a reply. "Proposal received. Matter of social relevance. Forwarded to the presidency for docket evaluation." I closed the computer, put away the robe and looked out the window. The street was wet, light reflections blinking on the sidewalk. On the other side of the glass, I saw my father leaning against the car, waiting for me. He didn't speak, just looked. That was the closest he'd ever come to asking. I went out, approached him. The air smelled of rain and regret. "Did you come to fight too?" "Yes." He shook his head. No. I came to understand. It was the first time I'd heard that phrase come out of his mouth. We stood there in silence, the world running around us, and we stopped, finally, in the same time. But deep down I knew, understanding is not the same as accepting. And something told me tomorrow's fight would be bigger than the case. It would be against the invisible inheritance of silence. When I got in the car, the radio was on. A reporter read the day's headlines. Court of Justice analyzes unprecedented proposal for public hearing on veiled racial discrimination in local businesses. My name came next, clear, firm, without mispronunciation. My father turned off the radio. We were quiet. And he murmured, "Now the whole neighborhood will know." I looked straight ahead without blinking. That's exactly the point, Dad. The next morning, the courthouse seemed fuller than usual. The elevator packed. The hallways full of people I didn't recognize. Interns whispering. Journalists waiting with discreet microphones. Lawyers walking too fast to seem indifferent. My name had already spread. The rumor was no longer about the bakery case. It was about the judge who decided to touch what everyone always pretended not to see. The court president scheduled an urgent meeting. It's just to discuss the format of the public hearing, they said. I could read between the lines. They wanted to measure the size of the bomb before it exploded. I entered the meeting room and saw my colleagues' gazes. A mix of curiosity, discomfort, and caution. The oldest judge opened the folder and got straight to the point. "Dr. Helena, your proposal is bold." "Correct," I corrected with a slight smile. "Perhaps inopportune. At a time when the image of justice needs balance, bringing such a sensitive debate. That's exactly what justice should do when it wants to be just, Your Honor. Balance what has always been crooked." The silence that followed was the kind that tests nerves. None of them looked me in the eyes. One of them cleared his throat and said, "We understand the merit, but the topic is delicate. And with your family being part of the case, there's a risk of personal bias." Risk of personal bias exists when someone acts out of revenge. I act out of conviction. The youngest judge watched me in silence, intrigued. Finally he spoke. "Doctor, do you really want to endure all this exposure? The public is cruel. Worse than the public is silence. It kills slowly." I left the meeting with a tense body, but a firm step. I knew every word of mine would be analyzed, distorted, questioned. And even so, I wouldn't back down. It was like driving on a wet road. Fear slips, but the steering must stay straight. I returned to my office and found a bouquet of flowers on the desk. Without a card. Just a short note, typewritten, as if someone wanted to seem neutral. "Not all pain needs to be public. Think carefully." I smiled sideways. When courage begins to bother, advice appears with expensive perfume. I picked up the flowers, smelled them out of politeness, and placed them in the trash. Then I opened the computer and began reviewing the meeting minutes. Each of their arguments was confirmation of why that hearing needed to happen. In the middle of this, a notification sound. New message from an unknown number. "You have courage, doctor. I admire that. But be careful. People who bother too much usually pay dearly." I blocked the number without responding. I opened the folder with the bakery case documents and saw, for the first time, the complete victim testimonies. 3 black teenagers. One of them said, "We just wanted to buy honey bread." The woman said it was sold out. "When a white girl came after us, she sold it." Another wrote, "The security guard made us show our backpack. He said it was policy. The policy never applied to others." I read and closed my eyes. For a second, I returned to that counter. The smell of burnt sugar, my mother's trained smile, the eyes that looked away from what hurt. I picked up the pen and wrote a note in the margin. When prejudice is routine, it stops being error. It becomes method. While I read, the intercom rang. It was the secretary. "Doctor, there's a reporter from TV Justice requesting an interview about the hearing. She said she wants to hear your personal motivation." I thought for a moment. "Tell her I'll only speak when the notice is published." "Yes, ma'am." After I hung up, I stood looking out the window. The sky was clear but heavy, the kind of day that seems to promise a storm. At the end of the workday, I picked up my phone and recorded a quick audio for my group of former public defender students. If they ever call you exaggerated, it's because you're getting close to the right wound. Don't back down. Press harder. That's where the truth hurts. I sent it and left the device on the desk. If you've ever felt the weight of fighting alone and still chose to continue, leave your comment here. This story is about courage but also about resistance. And shared resistance is the kind of strength the world doesn't know how to contain. I looked again at the pile of papers and thought about everything that would still come. The hearing, the looks, the headlines, my mother perhaps watching on television. Beside, fear still existed, but now it had another name, purpose. And as I turned off the office light, I saw my reflection in the window and realized what they called exaggeration was just the sound of my voice without filter. When the elevator opened, I found a dark envelope on the floor without a sender. Inside a flash drive. And a post-it stuck on top, handwritten. You think you know the whole truth, doctor? The flash drive weighed more than it should. Small, cold, harmless at first sight. But experience taught me it's always like this that truth arrives, disguised as something banal. I held the object between my fingers and felt a shiver, not of fear, but of recognition. This had the smell of clue, of threat, or both. I went back up to the office and locked the door. The room was plunged in silence, only the sound of rain beginning to hit the glass. I connected the flash drive to the computer. The folder opened with a single file, cfdnsinternalvideos.rar. My heart beat faster. The initials were from the bakery. I breathed deeply and clicked. Inside there were dozens of small security videos, all with date and time. I started watching. The first showed the store counter. My parents in the background serving customers. The movement was normal until 3 boys with backpacks entered. The manager made an almost imperceptible gesture with his head. A security guard appeared, pretending to organize shelves. He followed the boys down the aisle to the exit. One of them looked back suspicious, and I saw the expression I recognize from afar, the mix of shame and anger of someone who has already understood the reason for the care. The second video showed an adult black woman in uniform. She hands over a $50 bill and seconds later, the cashier asks to confirm with the manager. The camera captured her tense smile, a smile of someone who learned that arguing is losing. I stopped the video and rested my forehead on my hands. The air seemed too heavy to fit in my lungs. Among the files there was a text document. Opened it. It was an internal security report, digitally signed by the manager. Excerpts marked in bold. Avoid large groups of suspicious-looking youth. Monitor customers with caps, backpacks or public school uniforms. Discourage crowds near the display window. And at the end, what froze me. Approved by management. Marta and João Ramos. My parents' names. In firm, bureaucratic letters without emotion. There was the signature that transformed everyday racism into an official document. I felt something break inside, but it was a new kind of break, without tears, without despair. It was the snap of lucidity. I picked up the phone and called the Internal Affairs Office number. Good evening. This is Judge Helena Ramos, from the 3rd Civil Court. I need to file anonymous material that arrived at my office. Potentially relevant to an ongoing case. I want formal registration, without disclosure until forensic analysis. From the other side, the server's calm voice. Perfectly, doctor. We'll send a team tomorrow morning. I hung up and stood still, looking at the computer's dark screen. The image reflected in the glass was strange. Me, still halfway in the robe, tired face and eyes firmer than ever. I picked up my phone and opened the message group with former public defender colleagues. I wrote a short sentence. When evidence arrives on its own, it's a sign that someone wants the truth to breathe. I received a raised fist emoji and a heart. I smiled slightly. I wondered who might have sent me that. A remorseful employee. Some dissatisfied customer. Or someone from my own family trying to test me. Either way, the message was given. They weren't just being judged, they were being observed. I looked out the window. The rain was getting heavier, drawing long trails on the glass. Each drop seemed like a new file falling from the sky, washing away the dust of hypocrisy. I picked up the badge, took it off my neck and left it on the desk. I felt the weight of the symbol, the name, the position, the authority. It was funny, so many years trying to be recognized for this, and now the title seemed too small compared to the responsibility it brought. Before leaving, I recorded a short audio on my phone, almost like a diary. Sometimes, blood hurts more than the system. But that's exactly why we can't stop. It's not about punishing my parents. It's about dismantling the mechanism that created them. Tomorrow, when this evidence enters the case, the entire country will have to look at what it calls custom and admit the name for it is crime. I saved the file. Closed the computer. When I left the office, the corridor was empty, and the courthouse lights blinked under the storm. In the background, the echo of my steps seemed like the sound of a verdict approaching. I stopped for a moment before the golden sign on the wall. Palace of Justice. I touched the cold letters with my fingertips and whispered, "So be it then. But this time may it serve everyone." I went out to the street. The rain received me without mercy, and I let it soak me. It was the kind of purification that comes when truth finally decides to show itself. On the way to the car, a new message lit up the phone screen. An unknown number, without a profile photo. "You thought the shame was theirs. But you haven't seen everything the family is hiding yet." The phone vibrated in my hand. The message still lit on the screen like a threat written in fire. "You thought the shame was theirs. But you haven't seen everything the family is hiding yet." For a second I stood still. The street was deserted, the rain beating on the car hood like a war drum. Instinct said to delete it, pretend I didn't see it. But the woman I'd become learned not to turn away from shadows. I breathed deeply, sat in the driver's seat and copied the number in a notepad. Without fear but with method. On the way home, the windshield wiper scratching the water seemed like a metronome of memories. The city lights reflected on the asphalt, and I saw in flashes my father's face, rigid, silent, as if carrying a guilt he himself didn't know how to name. I arrived home close to midnight. I took off the robe, hung it in the closet and sat on the couch, still in my shoes. I picked up my phone and enlarged the message. No identified sender. No location data. Just the sentence. And below a link. My heart raced. I knew it could be a trap. A virus, an attempt at invasion, blackmail. But instinct told me this was from the same sender of the flash drive. And if someone was trying to come after me, they'd have to face a judge accustomed to reading between the lines of crime. I copied the link and opened it on an isolated computer, disconnected from the court systems. The page loaded slowly, black screen, then a single video. File under 01 Ramos family. Click. The video began with old images. Home videos. Me as a child playing on the bakery sidewalk. My mother sweeping the door, smiling at the camera. My father adjusting his apron. It was a good memory, until the recording moved forward. The same bakery years later. Internal security cameras, grainy image. In the lower corner of the screen, the same manager as always, talking to my father. The audio caption was auto-generated, but his voice was clear. "If this kind of customer insists, say the oven broke. And that's it," my father responded. "Better than having trouble later. You understand." The manager laughed. "I do. But Mrs. Marta is tougher than you." And my father added, also laughing, "She learned from fear. I learned from time." Paused the video. The air in the room seemed thinner. My father had always been the silent one, the one who let my mother handle things, who avoided arguments, who said, "It's not my problem." But there was the proof that it was. I let the video run to the end. The following images showed him signing a document, then waving at the camera while a group of young people was turned away at the bakery door. The automatic caption registered a short phrase. "They come too much. Better to cut it off before it gets worse." I closed the laptop and rested my face in my hands. It was no longer about public shame. It was about moral inheritance. Racism in my family wasn't an accident. It was learning passed down like a cake recipe. The phone vibrated again. New message, same number. The truth is worse when it's born inside the house, isn't it? I picked up the phone and responded for the first time. Who are you? The response came almost immediately. Someone who also grew up hearing they should speak quietly. Except I recorded it. That phrase hit me hard. There was anger there but also pain, a pain I recognized. What do you want? For you to see everything. Then decide if you want to keep pretending justice is impartial. I blocked the number and turned off the phone. But my body remained on alert, my mind ablaze. I stood up, went to the mirror and faced myself. The reflection returned a woman with tired eyes and a raised chin. I was no longer the girl asking for approval. I was the judge who now had to decide if her courage fit in the same last name as the guilty. I picked up my notebook, the same one where I recorded every detail of the investigation. I wrote, "Exposed truth heals but also separates. Those born in a divided house must choose whether to keep the roof or let in the sun." I closed the notebook and sat at the table with a cup of black coffee. The bitter taste brought me back to earth. I knew what would come. More evidence, more exposure, more attempts at silence. And I also knew there was no way back. I picked up the phone, turned it on again. "Detective, this is Judge Ramos. I need forensics on a video delivered anonymously. Tomorrow morning. Total discretion." "Yes, doctor." "Want me to go personally?" "I do. And bring someone you trust. The story is going to get bigger than the case." Before sleeping, I left the robe on the chair in sight. It wasn't a shield or a symbol. It was a reminder. My role is not to look away, even when the face is my own family's. When I closed my eyes, the sound of the phone vibrating again cut through the room. The screen blinked one last time before dawn swallowed everything. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. In front of the bakery. Bring courage. The early morning was too long for someone who didn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of lightning, that metallic smell that precedes a new kind of storm. At 8:45 a.m. I was parked across the street, in front of the bakery. The windows were impeccable as always. Sponge cakes aligned, pies covered with meringue, and that golden sign I myself helped paint at 12 years old. Bakery Ramos since 1983. It was ironic. Everything there smelled of tradition. And yet, what sustained those walls was the same prejudice that forced me to learn to resist with class. At 9 a.m. sharp, a black car stopped at the corner. Detective Enrique got out, accompanied by a forensic expert. They greeted me with a discreet wave, trying not to draw attention. "Did you bring the material?" he asked. I did. And I brought the context too. We entered together. The doorbell rang with that childhood sound, sweet and cruel at the same time. Behind the counter, my mother. Hair tied back, red eyes of someone who hadn't slept. Seeing them, she understood everything. "My God, Helena. Did you call the police to the house?" "It's not a house, Mom. It's a commercial establishment under investigation." She blinked slowly, her lips trembling. "You're really doing this?" "I'm not doing anything, Mom. Just letting what already exists appear." The detective requested the security files from the internal system. The manager, pale, tried to stall. Said the hard drive had a problem. The expert looked at me, needing no translation. "With the judge's authorization, we collect the server." "Authorized," I replied. They collected the equipment in silence. Customers watched from afar, some whispering. I felt the looks cutting my skin like thin blades. It was the price of exposing what the entire city had always pretended not to see. My mother came after me, whispering through her teeth. "Do you want to destroy our reputation? Your father is at home, ashamed." I turned firm. Reputation is when others think you're fair. Conscience is when you really are. The sound of packages being sealed by the expert sounded like the closing of an era. At the counter, the digital clock read 9:37 when my father appeared at the door. He wore the same apron as always, the same tired look from every morning of my childhood. "Helena, is it really you doing this?" "It's me, Dad." He looked at me for long seconds and then only said, "You could have warned me. And you could have listened to me before." The detective interrupted. "We need him to sign the equipment delivery form." My father signed. The pen trembled. The sound of the paper tearing the carbon was the only noise in the hall. When he finished, he left the pen on the counter and faced me. "Think you're fixing the world?" "No, Dad. I just don't want to live in one that pretends not to be broken anymore." I left the bakery with a churning stomach, but an open chest. Outside, the fresh morning air seemed like another kind of prayer, not of forgiveness, but of liberation. The expert called me aside and whispered, "There's something you need to see." She opened the notebook and showed a fragment of files recovered from the flash drive. It wasn't just the bakery. It was other establishments in the city. Bakeries, pharmacies, grocery stores, all with similar spreadsheets, guiding differentiated attention for customer profiles. It was a network. An entire system of discrimination disguised as protocol. My heart raced. My family's case was just the first thread of a much larger web. The detective scratched his chin, astonished. "Doctor, this is going to make noise." "Noise is what happens when silence ends, detective." While we talked, my phone vibrated. Anonymous message, same number. "Now you understand. They're not the only ones. They just had the bad luck of being first." I looked at the horizon. The city continued the same, but I saw differently. Every commercial facade seemed to hide an entire history of injustices that had always passed as routine. I breathed deeply and said, almost to myself, "Then it won't be just a hearing. It will be an exposure." If you've ever seen racism hide behind a standard procedure, share this story. Because what is silenced on one corner repeats itself on all the others. And the only antidote against custom is light. While the police loaded the boxes with sealed hard drives, the sun broke through the clouds. The light hit the window and made the golden sign shine. Bakery Ramos, since 1983. But in that reflection, I saw another inscription, invisible until then. The century changed. Now the recipe is mine. I got in the car, the window still fogged from tense breathing, and let the engine start on its own. Behind me, my mother cried on the sidewalk, her apron dirty with sugar. I looked in the rearview mirror and said quietly, "This is how cleaning begins, Mom. With truth." And I drove on while behind me, for the first time, the bakery was truly naked. Without windows, without excuses, without varnish. The news spread faster than I imagined. The next day, local news sites were already displaying headlines. Network of businesses investigated for veiled discrimination. Case began with complaint at traditional bakery. With each click, my name appeared between the lines. Not as anyone's daughter, but as the judge who broke the silence. The office became a whirlwind. Piles of emails, phone calls, interview invitations, notes of repudiation and praise from people I'd never seen. Colleagues greeted me in the hallway with that half smile that mixes respect and discomfort, the kind of look that only exists when someone does what others didn't have the courage to do. In the middle of all this, a handwritten letter arrived by mail. The simple envelope, no sender. I recognized the handwriting before even opening. It was from my father. "Helena, your mother doesn't sleep, but I need to say what she can't. You brought shame to us, it's true. But somehow, you also brought something I can't even name. I spent my life believing that being respected was the same as being accepted. Now I understand that respect without conscience is just disguised fear. I still don't know how to look at you without remembering what we did, but I want to learn. Your father." I folded the paper and kept it in the drawer, without responding. Sometimes silence is the only possible language between two people who finally saw the same guilt from different sides. That same afternoon, I participated in an extraordinary meeting at the court. The presidency confirmed. The public hearing was scheduled. The main auditorium would be opened, and the press would have access. "Dr. Helena, are you sure you want to conduct it personally?" asked an advisor. "I am. It's my jurisdiction and it's my duty. But what about your family? My family is part of the evidence, not the impediment. At night, I sat at the dinner table with the television on. The reporter commented on the investigations and mentioned that other victims are emerging. He showed faces. A teenager, an elderly woman, a young man in uniform. People who for years swallowed the same humiliation. And now, seeing a black woman in a robe stand up, decided to speak too. That was it. That was why. The phone rang. Private number. Answered. Helena. The voice was tremulous, low. Mom. I saw the reports. I imagined. She breathed deeply. I can't leave the house. People look at me on the street like I'm a monster. Maybe that's the price of looking at the whole mirror for the first time. You speak like a judge, but you're my daughter. And maybe it's time for you to see that the two are the same woman. On the other side of the line, silence. Then just one phrase. Can I go to the hearing? You can. But to listen, not to defend yourself. Hung up. I stood looking at the cup of coffee cooling on the table. The bitter taste seemed to fit the entire day. That night, I opened the laptop and began reviewing the opening statement I would make at the hearing. Each word was chosen carefully, like someone stitching a wound. I knew that text wasn't just about institutional racism. It was about emotional inheritance. About the weight that color carries even inside the home. I wrote, racism is sustained not only in laws, but in small daily concessions. In smiles that avoid conflict. In phrases that say, it's not that bad. In the fear of losing the little respect the world grants. Today, we're not here to punish individuals, but to dismantle the system that formed them. I deleted the period. Breathe. I rewrote. And yes, also to look in the eyes of those who taught us fear. I closed the notebook and leaned back in the chair. The clock read 11:47 p.m. The city slept, but I didn't. I knew that from there on, nothing would be just legal. It would be personal, political, ancestral. The next morning, when I parked at the courthouse, the square was packed. Reporters, students, onlookers. Among the faces, one stopped me. My mother, in a simple dress and tired look, sitting in the front row of the auditorium, next to a group of young black people. And for the first time I realized, she wasn't there to hide. She was there to watch. The auditorium smelled of printed paper and expectation. The white lights reflected on the marble floor, and the murmur of voices created a tension that vibrated in the air, as if the city itself had held its breath. TV cameras aligned on the side, microphones prepared. And there, in the center, the hearing table with the golden plaque. Public hearing, veiled discrimination in commercial establishments. I sat at the main table, the robe resting on my shoulders with the weight of everything that came before. When I looked at the public, I saw everything. Journalists, law students, merchants, activists, onlookers, and right in the middle of the front row, my mother. Her face was serene, but her look was a mixture of pride, fear, and surrender. She held the same handkerchief she used when she took me to school. I would recognize that fabric even in the dark. The microphone turned on. I declare this public hearing open. The sound of my own voice went through me. Firm. Irreversible. I explained the purpose. To investigate systematic practices of racial exclusion disguised as security protocols. I reinforced that it wasn't about revenge, but about reparation. And that justice isn't a spectacle. It's a mirror. While I spoke, the audience divided between attentive eyes and uncomfortable looks. Some people nodded in approval. Others crossed their arms, defensive. But everyone listened. And that was already a victory. The first to testify was one of the teenagers who appeared in the bakery videos. Tremulous voice but determined. We just wanted to buy honey bread. Just that. But the lady said she didn't sell to school groups anymore. Then a white woman came and bought the same cake. That's when I understood that the problem was me. The silence after the testimony was absolute. You could hear the sound of the air conditioning. My mother lowered her eyes. Other testimonies followed. black workers from other businesses, customers who described disguised searches, suspicious looks, interrupted service. The entire city seemed to unfold before me, showing what it had always pretended didn't exist. Among the witnesses, an older man stood up, hat in his hands, hoarse voice. I was security at a bakery. They told me to follow suspicious customers. But you know what suspicious was? Dark color, simple clothes. I obeyed because I needed the job. Today I see. It was just fear disguised as rule. Each word was a stone removed from a wall we took generations to build. When he finished, the audience applauded him standing up. During the break, my mother came to me. Helena, I didn't know it was that much. You knew, Mom. You just never wanted to see. She breathed deeply, eyes watering. Do you think there's still time to fix it? For those who want to learn, there always is. She nodded slowly. I'm trying. Then start by staying until the end. We returned to the courtroom. The last witness was Detective Enrique. He presented the forensic evidence. The spreadsheets, the emails, the videos. And finally, the final report confirming the discrimination network among the businesses. When he showed the last document on the screen, the room held its breath. There it was, at the top of the list, the bakery's digital signature. And right below, dozens of other establishments in the city. This is not an isolated case, said the detective. It's learned behavior, passed on like an invisible manual. And it started long before this generation. I looked at the audience. I saw people crying. I saw journalists typing frantically. I saw my mother with her head raised, finally without denying. I took the microphone and closed the session with a firm but choked voice. Today, this court does not judge people. It judges habits. It judges the inheritance of fear disguised as good manners. It judges the silence we call prudence. And if there is guilt, it doesn't reside only in the accused, but in all who preferred peace to truth. I looked at my mother. She didn't look away. It's not easy to be the first to break the pact of silence. But sometimes, love also manifests when we decide not to protect the mistake anymore. The audience stood up in slow, dense, emotional applause. I felt my legs tremble, but my heart was calm. Justice for the first time seemed to speak my language. If this story reminded you of something you lived, a crossed look, a disguised exclusion, it's not that bad, share. Because every time someone recognizes what they used to pretend not to see, a wall falls. While the room emptied, I remained seated for a few minutes, watching the chair where my mother had been. Her handkerchief was left forgotten on the seat. I picked it up carefully, folded it and kept it in the inner pocket of the robe. Outside, the press waited. Flashes, questions, microphones. A reporter shouted, "Dr. Helena, what's the feeling after this historic hearing?" I answered calmly, without hesitation. Justice has no color. But for a long time it had an owner. Today it has a voice. And I crossed the corridor filled with an unprecedented certainty. What began as a family scandal had become a collective manifesto. In the middle of the commotion, an employee ran to me with her phone in hand. "Doctor, a new video arrived at the official email. The subject says, 'The story isn't over yet.'" I returned to the office, still with the sound of applause echoing in my ears. The walls seemed taller, the air denser. The feeling was that silence, after so much noise, gained weight. I closed the door behind me and sat in front of the computer. The email was there, at the top of the inbox, with the subject the employee mentioned. "The story isn't over yet." The sender was anonymous, but the address seemed created especially for this. Justice with proof at. I breathed deeply and clicked. Inside, a single video link. No text, no explanation. Just the title. File 02, Ramos and Feng before. Press play. The screen showed a familiar environment. The storage room at the back of the bakery. The same one where I used to play as a child. The recording was recent. My parents were there, sitting face to face. The camera seemed hidden, filming from above. My mother's voice emerged first, tremulous. I didn't know she would go this far, Joao. You should have stopped this before. And say what, Marta? That we always knew we were doing wrong and continued because it was profitable. The following silence was the kind that needs no explanation. Helena only did what we should have done. But I don't want to see our family name destroyed. The name isn't being destroyed, Marta. It's being returned to those who deserve to carry it. That phrase went through me like knife and cure at the same time. My father, for the first time, seemed to understand. The video continued. He got up, went to a shelf and took out an old cardboard box. Inside, newspaper clippings, photographs, notes. On top, a yellowed sheet with a bank seal. Special credit, Municipal Commercial Incentive Program, 1984. The document showed that the bakery only existed because a white merchant, owner of a local market, had used my father's name as a front to receive financing denied to him for being black. In exchange, my father had accepted to share the profits and maintain the store's discreet profile. It was a dirty pact. A pact that explained everything. The fear, the submission, the prudence my family cultivated so much. They told me it was the only way to open a business back then, my father confessed in the video. I accepted because I wanted to be respected. But the price was erasing who I was. And respect never came, my mother responded, crying. Only the fear of losing what was never ours. Paused the video. I leaned my forehead on my hands. That was more than a revelation. It was the genealogy of shame. I opened a new document and began typing the report. Additional evidence indicates that the discrimination practiced by Ramos Bakery has a structural origin, linked to a historic agreement of racial and economic character. What was perpetuated for decades under the appearance of tradition was, in fact, a system of complicity. The words came out almost by themselves. There was no anger, no pity, just a cold, necessary lucidity. When I finished, I closed the laptop and stood looking at the city through the window. The sunset reflected on the buildings as if the world had turned into a mirror. Down there, the square where the hearing had taken place was still full. Young people taking photos in front of the courthouse. Improvised signs said, "It's not exaggeration, it's resistance. Justice has a face." My phone vibrated. A new message from the anonymous number. "Now you know where the silence came from. What will you do with it?" I stopped for a moment before responding. "Transform it into sound." I sent it. I stood watching the screen darken, reflecting my face. The woman facing me, there was no longer a daughter trying to prove something. She was the voice of an entire generation that finally had a name, a position, and courage. At the same instant, the office landline rang. The secretary answered and called me, distressed. "Dr. Helena, there's an urgent call from international press. They want to confirm if you're going to present this new video at the second public hearing." Picked up the phone. "Yes," I replied calmly. "And not just present it." "What do you mean, doctor?" "I'm going to start the testimony with it." I hung up, looked out the window again and murmured to myself, "If silence was inheritance, may truth be the will." On the morning of the second hearing, the courthouse seemed different. The building's facade was covered with banners, cameras, students, and improvised signs. The air smelled of coffee, light rain, and historic urgency. I walked through the central corridor in silence, not out of fear but out of reverence. I knew the weight of that moment. When I entered the auditorium, the audience stood up. Not in applause but in respect. There was a living quietness, a kind of silence that precedes change. On the main table, the flash drive containing the new video. Tiny, silver, like the first one I received, but now a symbol of something greater. Truth without an owner. I picked up the microphone. Today, the hearing is not just about Ramos Bakery. It's about everything the word respect tried to cover up for decades. My hands were steady. And what we're going to watch now is not a denunciation. It's a mirror. The video began. The auditorium plunged into deep silence. My father's voice sounded clear on the speaker. Respect never came. Only the fear of losing what was never ours. Some journalists lowered their cameras, unable to register the weight of the moment. The image showed my parents in front of the box of documents, the confession, the pact, the inheritance of silence. When it ended, no one applauded. The most audible sound was that of held breaths. I spoke looking at the audience and especially at my mother sitting in the front row. My family's story is not an exception. It's the rule. It's the portrait of a country that learned to disguise prejudice as good manners, and to call cowardice tradition. But the time has come to return names to truths. The name of fear is control. The name of shame is omission. And the name of justice is courage. A woman in the audience started crying. Another stood up and shouted, "Thank you." And the shout became a chorus. Emotion took over the entire hall. For the first time, the courthouse didn't seem like a courthouse. Seemed like a collective baptism. I descended from the table, walked to my mother. I handed her the handkerchief I still kept in the robe's pocket. "You don't need to hide the tears, Mom. They're also part of healing." She held my hand, her voice choked. "And you are the part one never knew how to create." I smiled for the first time in days. Behind us, Detective Enrique approached and whispered, "Doctor, this is already having repercussions outside the country. Foreign press is calling it the Ramos case." "Let them call it that," I replied. "At least once, our name will serve to fix what it helped to damage." The rest of the day was a succession of interviews, hugs, tears, and necessary silences. The evidence would be forwarded to the Oversight Office. The investigations would continue. But inside me, the sentence was already given. There was no going back. At dusk, I left through the courthouse's side door, escaping the cameras. The light of late afternoon fell on the square, golden warm. The young people who had testified were now taking photos, smiling. I saw in them what I never had, the certainty of belonging. I walked to the car. Halfway there, a young black woman, maybe 17, stopped me. "Dr. Helena, can I tell you something?" "You can. When I saw you on TV, I understood that I didn't need to apologize for existing." I was speechless for a moment. I held her shoulder and replied, "Then it was all worth it." She smiled and left. I sat in the car, looked at the reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman facing me now no longer carried guilt. I breathed deeply and whispered, "My father was right, respect didn't come. But I did." I looked out the window, the sun disappearing behind the courthouse. If this story went through you, if you ever had to rebuild your dignity in silence, if you ever transformed wounds into strength, subscribe here. Because when a black woman raises her voice, it's not just for herself. It's for all who came before and all who will come after. I turned the key, the engine purred, and the radio, as if the universe understood the moment, began playing an old song my father used to listen to at dawn at the bakery. Smiled. And before leaving, I looked at the lit courthouse and said quietly, "Justice done. History rewritten. And for the first time, clean inheritance."